Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Korea Society. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this very special occasion, the launch of the YT Hwang Family Foundation series on ethics and common values. With generous support from the YT Hwang Family Foundation, the Korea Society is launching this new lecture and conversation series in order to promote the understanding of central themes of our human existence, morality, ethics, personal responsibility, compassion, and civility. With this series of lectures by distinguished speakers in conversation with extraordinary individuals who exemplify the universal values in line with the mission of the YT Hwang Family Foundation and the Korea Society, we hope you will be reminded of the timeless guiding principles and be inspired as you navigate the complex world we live in today. This series is made possible with the generous support from the YT Hwang Family Foundation and its founder and chair, Mr. YT Hwang. Mr. Hwang has been a close friend and supporter of the Korea Society for many years, and we are once again grateful for the generosity of Mr. Hwang and the board members of the YT Hwang Family Foundation. And now, please join me in welcoming Mr. YT Hwang to the podium.
My background is in business. I'm neither a scholar nor a philosopher, but I have always been interested as a human being, how we should live in this increasingly complicated digital world. I never believed that there is anything in this world that solely belongs to me. With this in mind, I started our foundation, and I'm delighted that we found a worthy partner in the Korea Society to launch this new inspiring series. I think there is an ever-growing need to understand ourselves and humanity as a whole, and that it is necessary to remind ourselves what is right, what is commonsensical, and what is truly important. The roots of all the conflicts we experience today are connected to our own humanity. And I believe that by acknowledging each other's humanity, we can solve the fundamental problems in our society. I sincerely hope that this series can offer many thoughts and opinions on how we should approach the issues and solve them. I would like to thank my board members for all they do for our foundation, and I would like to thank Mr. Thomas Byrne and the Korea Society for hosting this series. And a very special thanks, of course, goes to our inaugural speaker, Dr. Yong Kim. This is only the beginning. We hope that all of you will continue to support this series and the Korea Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hwang. As Mr. Hwang mentioned, we are honored to have Dr. Yong Kim as the inaugural speaker of the series. Yong Kim, MD, PhD, is Vice Chairman and Partner at Global Infrastructure Partners, a fund that invests in infrastructure projects across several sectors around the world. A physician and anthropologist, Dr. Kim's career has revolved around health, education, and improving the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable. He was born in South Korea to parents who fled the violence of the Korean War and grew up in Iowa, where his father was a practicing dentist and his mother was a philosopher and theologian. Kim graduated from Brown University, then became one of the first students to study jointly for a medical degree from Harvard Medical School and a PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. While at Harvard, Kim co-founded Partners in Health, a nonprofit medical organization that provides health care to poor countries on 4 continents. From 2003 to 2005, Kim served as the director of the World Health Organization's HIV/AIDS department. Following his service at the WHO, Dr. Kim was chair in Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, chief of the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and director of the Francois-Xavier Bagnon Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard School of Public Health. In 2009, he was named the 17th president of Dartmouth College, where he served until he was nominated by President Barack Obama to lead the World Bank Group. From July 2012 to February 2019, Dr. Kim served as the 12th president of the World Bank Group. He received a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, was recognized as one of America's 25 best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, and was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. I am very much looking forward to hearing from him. It's not the first time Dr. Kim spoke at a Korea Society event. He was our keynote speaker at the 2015 annual dinner here in New York City at the Plaza Hotel. This evening, Dr. Kim will share his insights and wisdom regarding the public health crisis in Korea. The title of this lecture is Facing Korea's Existential Public Health Crisis, the Triple-demic of Low Birth Rate, Suicide, and Loneliness. Please welcome Dr. Yong Kim.
Thanks so much, Tom. And it's great to be back here. Mr. Hwang, I felt very challenged by what you wrote about this lecture series. And so I took the charge that you put forth very seriously. And so as Tom mentioned, we're going to be talking about subjects that are not necessarily the happiest, but this is real. As I learned about this so-called triple-demic, actually, at first I was embarrassed that I knew so little about what was really a fundamental crisis for the country of my birth. So let me jump into it. I just want to thank a few people. Hwang Ryu is in the audience. She and I have been working together on trying to tackle mental health issues in Korea, and we came upon this data and this phenomenon in a way that I think was, as I said, extremely troubling to me, that this is not better understood. Also, I've had a chance to speak with some really wonderful people. Peter Chang, he's a Korean-American professor of sociology at Harvard, who really taught me a lot. Clara Han, a former student of mine, now an anthropology professor, also has been working on these issues. It turns out that there are a lot of people who've been devoting their research efforts at trying to figure out how to take this forward. But unfortunately, as I'll show you, the data are not encouraging. So let me start by this is not anyone related to me, but it could have been my mother. My mother was a refugee during the Korean War. She's 90 years old this year, and she literally had to walk at least part of the way from Seoul to Incheon to get on a boat that took them to Jeju to escape the invading army. And she was 13 at the time, so this was in 1946. So she was a child of the Korean War. This is a report that I read at the World Bank soon after I got there. So this was from 1962, and at one point, probably about a month into my tenure at the World Bank Group, I had a stack of papers on my desk. The vice president of the East Asia regional office wrote me a note, and it just said, "Funny how wrong we get it sometimes." And in 1962, the consensus inside the World Bank Group is that Korea would not be eligible for a World Bank loan because they had no hope of paying it back. They didn't refer to it officially as a basket case, but that was really the general sense. There's no way, as this says, Korea would find it difficult without foreign aid to provide its people with more than the bare necessities of life. And so there was the sense that even if you provided a loan to Korea, they'd never be able to pay it back. So why would you do that? So Eventually they did. The next year, finally it happened. They got their first loan in 1963. It was for a road, a high-speed a highway construction. And then in 1968, they took their second loan, and it was for education, for which they were ridiculed. The World Bank staff was saying, can you believe it? They're so poor, and they're taking a loan for education. Well, that, of course, worked out well, but this was the sense in 1962. Now, I was 3 years old then. Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. The birth rate at that time was 6 children per child on average. So a completely different setting than we have today. So to fast forward through many sort of parts of my life, I did grow up in Iowa. Interestingly, the town that I grew up in, the first time I went to China as World Bank Group president, I was going to meet Xi Jinping. And I was reading about his background, and I read, and some of you may have heard, he spent about a month living in a small Midwestern town when he was in his 40s and working in agriculture. So he lived in a small town for about a month to learn about American agriculture. And that town, I found out, was my hometown, Muscatine, Iowa. So I told some of my staff about this, and it must have gotten back to China because when I first met him, I said, President Xi, it's a great honor to meet you. We have something in common. And he said, I know, you're from Muscatine, Iowa. How are my friends in Muscatine? So I was prepared. I prepared my translator. I said, well, that makes us homeboys. And apparently there's a word in Chinese that exactly is homeboys. And he laughed. And so for 7 years, I would see him 2 or 3 times a year because of the G20 meetings and the many different meetings we'd go to. We would joke that, we're homeboys from Iowa. And so I grew up in Iowa, went to Brown University, and then found myself at Harvard Medical School asking a very fundamental question. So a very famous, unfortunately, recently deceased physician, Paul Farmer, and I were both doing our MDs and PhDs together. And the question we asked ourselves was, here we are at Harvard University getting an MD and a PhD, and we kept saying, so given our ridiculously elaborate educations, what's the nature of our responsibility to the world? And we concluded that it was to make a preferential option for the poor in healthcare. In other words, we were going to do everything we could to provide the best possible quality of care to the poorest people on the planet. This is my first trip to Haiti in 1988. Haiti was the focus of our original work because, well, for one thing, it was the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere and one of the poorest in the world, and is still to this day incredibly poor. And it's essentially now the only really failed state in the Western Hemisphere. But we started there. We worked there for many, many years, and we pledged to do everything we could to bring the best of healthcare services to even the poorest people. So we met people like this. Oops. This is Joseph Jun, and this was in 2003. Now, by 2003, we already had been utilizing HIV medicines in the United States, the miraculous, highly active antiretroviral therapy since 1996. And so you never saw people in the United States who looked like these skeletal people suffering from HIV. And so we begged, borrowed, and stole and brought the HIV medications down to Haiti, and this was him just a few months later, right? So, this is not a big deal for anyone who's lived through the HIV epidemic, but it turned out to be a really big deal for George Bush. And so these before and after pictures, along with the great Tony Fauci, Paul went into the White House late one night and showed President Bush's aides all of these pictures of before and after of what could happen with really a very little amount of money in terms of providing HIV treatment. So President Bush then, a few months later, declared that he would treat people with HIV all over the world. It changed everything. I went to the World Health Organization. We started really a movement called 3x5 to try to dramatically scale up treatment for HIV. Now, the reason I tell you this is because when we did this, when we started saying everybody in the world has to get treatment for HIV, 99.99999% of the physicians said, no, you're crazy, it's impossible. Now, it's hard to believe that that a group of physicians would tell 25 million people in Africa living with HIV, sorry, it's too expensive, you're all dead. But that's exactly what they did. And so we had very few allies. Tony Fauci, in fact, was one of our allies. We convinced the world that we had to do this. I went to WHO to work for my good friend at that time, the first ever Korean person to become head of the World Health Organization, Lee Jong-wook. And we worked together and we scaled up treatment. We got up to about 1 million. We were trying to get 3 million on treatment in just 2 years. We didn't get there, but we got to 1 million. And as of today, there are 27 million people in the world getting HIV treatment from a time where everyone was saying, it's impossible, don't even think about it. So this is my background. This is the kind of problems I have been taking on. If I can see that there's something, there's a gap either in imagination, there's a gap in the kind of thinking that Mr. Hwang talked about, the sense that, these things are not mine. Everyone should have access to the fruits of modern medicine. We at Partners in Health, the organization I work with, this is what we focused on. And frankly, it's what I've tried to focus on in every job that I have. Through several iterations, I became president of the World Bank. And interestingly, in one of my first campaign stops in trying to get the job, I went to Ethiopia and I met the legendary Prime Minister Meles of Ethiopia. And as I sat down, the first thing he asked me was, what do you know about Sema Undong, right? And I thought, what do you mean? He said, well, we've been looking at all the different development examples in the world. We're not a huge giant like China. We don't have the same literacy rate that Japan had in going through its development process, but we think we can replicate what happened in Korea. So he had made all of his ministers and his aides study Korean development. Right? And so that's when I sort of knew, wow, this is really interesting. And people even in Africa reacted differently to me because I wasn't the typical American, and everybody was asking me about Korea. It was wonderful back then because there was less understanding of the problems that I'm going to talk to you about today, and everyone wanted to know, how did Korea do it? What is the foundation of the Korean miracle? How can we follow that path? Well, in so many ways, I was basking in this admiration for Korea, and it's still very much, there has never been a time that there is so much attention to Korea. I was talking with Professor Chang just the other day, and he teaches a class in modern Korean history. And so I said, is it almost all Korean Americans? And he said, no. He said, it's about half Korean Americans and half people from all over the world, many of whom speak really good Korean. So apparently, all throughout the world, people have been so enamored with K-pop and K-dramas that the industry of learning Korean language has really spread. Another great friend of mine, Mickey Lee from CJ, whom many of you know from her work in building the K-pop industry and the K-drama industry, says that they do K-pop concerts all over the world, and people from everywhere are singing along with the lyrics in Korean. So on the one hand, we have this amazing situation where there's an Academy Award, Parasite won an Academy Award, but again, the star of Parasite just committed suicide. And it is an indication of social unrest and difficulty that, again, I have felt embarrassed that I didn't know more about. So Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. Now, there has been a fertility drop globally, but as you can see in the light blue, Korea has outdone everybody. So in 1980, 1960, I was on the left-hand side, the number of children that each woman would have on average was 6. Right? This was just not too long ago, a year after I was born. And this is a graph that goes out to about 2015 or so. But in 2024, the expectation is that the birth rate will go to 0.7. Now, in order to just replace the population, every woman has to have 2 children, right? Because there's men and women. and over their lifetime, they have to have 2 children. 0.7 is the lowest number ever seen. So the birth rate in Korea is right now the lowest that has ever been measured. A big reason for this, of course, is there's also less interest in marriage. So if you look at the age-specific marriage rates for men, in 1985, among those in their 20s, it was 49%. Now it's down to 7%. But look at the rate for women. Women in their 20s, it's the dark graph that's on the lower part. So in 1985, 81% of women in their 20s were married. Now it's 17%. So now, there's a reason I talk specifically about birth rate and marriage, because in other countries, they have addressed the problem of low birth rate by having many more children, quote unquote, out of wedlock. But as you can see, the top line is Italy. Italy's birth rate has gone back up from a low because there are more women having children out of wedlock. But in Japan and Korea, it's still not happening. So the birth rate is directly tied to the marriage rate in those 2 countries, far more than in European countries or others that are also facing the population crisis. Excuse me. So reasons for not marrying. Everyone will recognize these. Lack of funds, relative asset holding is going to be very important in every country, but it's especially important. Not feeling necessity. People just feel like there's less need to get married. Job instability, the burden of childbirth and rearing. I'll talk more about each of these. Freedom in life, unable to meet a partner. These are the reasons for people not marrying in Korea. Now, again, it should be very, very obvious, but of course we see big differences in marriage rates among those with more resources versus less. You have to have money, and a lot of it, a lot more of it than before, for men and women to feel that they can go ahead and get married. Oops. Right. So how does this compare with the rest of the world? So the data there we're showing you from 2021, 0.8 children, and again, it's going to go down again to 0.7. That's less than half of the OECD average. And so if you also look at the mean age of women when they have their first child, Korea is all the way over here because it's the highest. It's the highest age on average of having your first child, 32.6 years. Again, the highest of all OECD countries. Now, reasons for not having children. Again, this for anyone who's spent any time in Korea or who's read about Korea, this is these numbers should not surprise anyone. The economic burden, having work-life balance, of course, the low marriage rate, gender inequality, and the differences in the way women and men are treated in the workplace, income disparities, of course, cultural factors that are so focused on education, but also the cost of education. The cost of education for students, I'll show you in the next slide, is very high in Korea. But look at this graph, right? So this graph shows you the share of household work and childcare done by men. Korea has by far the lowest of any of the countries in this particular sampling. So expenditures on child rearing, is it really that expensive in Korea? Well, in fact, it's the most expensive in all of the OECD. So in Korea, it's the proportion is 7.8% of GDP is spent on child rearing activities. So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Home ownership rates have gone down dramatically. Even in the 40 to 60-year-old age group, there's only a 44% of people own a home. And the graphs here on the right, the first is how many people think positively about marriage. So the whole population is on the top, and young people from 19 to 34 have a much lower sense that marriage is important. Then on the bottom graph, it shows the sense that you don't need to have children. So on the top is young people. Young people at a rate of 53.5% don't think it's necessary to have children, even those who are married. Now, why is this important? Well, over on the left is the classic sort of population diagram where it shows the percentage of older people and younger people. So the current average age in Korea is 45. This is going to increase to 50 by 2031. And by 2070, I mean, my kids will be very much alive and working in 2070. The average age will be 62 years. So the average age of the Korean population will be 62. By 2040, the youth population is expected to decrease by half. Just from 2020, just from today, in the next 17 years, the population of young people will decrease by half. The national population will decline, and that 27% compared to 2020 by 2070. It's the highest, most rapidly aging population in the world. So just to put a face on it, Son Heung-min, whom, I mean, I'm not a follower of soccer or football, but I know I see his commercials every time I walk through the airports. So in 1999, he was born. That year, 710,000 babies. In 2023, 240,000 babies were born. So a third of the number of babies that were born in 1991. Which led David Coleman to say that Korea faces the danger of extinction by 2750. Now, that's 700 years in the future, but extinction is a very radical way of thinking about this. But this, just to emphasize, this is a fundamental existential crisis. And I'll show you, a lot of things have been tried, and it continues to go down. So for the Korean economy, of course, this is going to be disastrous for the Korean economy. Estimates are that as a 1% decrease in the working age population leads to 0.59% decrease in GDP, 1% increase in the dependent population results in a 0.17% decrease in GDP as well. So both of those things are happening at the same time. Working age population is going down. Number of elderly people who are dependent on the Social Security system is going up. Now, you probably can't see this well. Okay, but this is just a diagram of all the things that Korea has tried to do to increase the birth rate. So when you're born, you get 2 million, about $2,000. And then from 0 to 1, you get now a million won a month, about $1,000 a month. And it continues from 1 to 2, you get another amount. From 2 to 7, elementary school, you get an amount. Middle school, high school, college scholarships, partial college scholarships for the first 2 children, full scholarship for your 3rd child. Right? In all, from the mid-2000s to today, the spending has been to the tune of well over $200 billion. And it hasn't worked. So it's not like nothing has been tried. All of these incentives are in place, but it hasn't worked. It continues to go down. Now, I've talked about Professor Chung already, but these are all graphs and insights from him. And here are his ideas about what could be done. And I show them to you because I think they raise very important questions about what might be possible and what the Korean society will tolerate. So immigration reform. We need a lot more immigration. We need immigration to come not just in the form of future husbands or wives, but to try to create a diverse, perhaps even multiracial, multilingual society. Is that possible in Korea? Well, we know that would be very, very difficult. And there's such a strong national identity that every time I have mentioned this, can you really change in a fundamental way the way you think about immigration? It's very, very difficult. Public housing, right? So public housing, one of the things I learned was that there is subsidized housing for young people to try to, again, induce people to say, you have housing now, we're going to build this subsidized housing. But the subsidized housing apparently is all in one place. So if you are living in that place, everybody knows that you're getting subsidized housing. So is there a solution to that? Well, in Singapore, probably 80 to 90% of the housing for young people is public. And it's everywhere. It's in every neighborhood. And so you can't distinguish between people. There's no prejudice against people living in a certain area because it's all public housing. Is that something that Korea could do? housing values would drop pretty dramatically in many places. But there, the point being, there are solutions out there. Will Korea step up and do it? And of course, the objections to doing something like that, of course, will be very strong. Gender. So, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and some very smart, what's the right words? People who understand Korean society very deeply have said that gender inequality is different now than it used to be. My understanding is that young men feel disenfranchised in some ways, they tell me, even more than women. And that the conflict between men and women is part of what drove the last Korean election. So it's not a simple, gender inequality calculation, but you've seen things like, the share of housework that men do. There is still, of course, gender inequality in Korea. And without taking on gender inequality, it will be very difficult to have an impact on the birth rate. So, and I added this to Professor Chang's slides. What he told me was that what we really need is to build a team that includes academics, people from civil society, government officials, people from the private sector, working together to evaluate what of that $200 billion spent actually worked. Is there anything that's been working? And are there things that they've put money into that absolutely have had no impact? One of the things he told me is that he had a second child, and an additional $300, $400 a month would not convince him to have a third child or a second child. That's not what drives people's decisions about birth rates. There has to be something more, and what is that? It's not really been studied. There are many people who are trying to get the government data, but it's not widely available. It hasn't been studied. This is something that could be done. Let's go on to the next happy subject, loneliness. Why is this important? Again, I feel embarrassed that I didn't pay more attention to this during my medical studies and during the work that we were doing all over the world. So this is from a British group called Campaign to End Loneliness. Loneliness is, it's not just I'm feeling lonely. It increases the risk of depression and then, of course, suicide. It affects the biological stress mechanism. It's linked to a 64% increased risk of developing dementia. It makes people more likely to rate their health as poor. And this is the piece of data that really shocked me. Saying you're lonely in a questionnaire is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of your life expectancy. Right? So it's actually more impactful. As much as we talk about obesity and inactivity and encourage people to get active and lose weight, loneliness has a bigger impact on life expectancy than either of those things. Right? So it also increases the risk of high blood pressure. Now, this is, again, I've learned so much in this process. This is how the housing situation has changed over the last 5 decades now, I think. So in 1960, 48%, the green, of people lived in households of 6 people or more. That was me. Our household had more than 6 people. We had many extended family living with us. And in the bottom, in 1960, this was just after the war ended. It was still a confusing time. 2.3% lived in single-person households. By 1970, as things settled down, 0.6% of Korean people lived in single-person households. By 2015, it had gone up to 26%, and by 2022, that number was 41%. So from 0.6% in 1970, that number increased to 41%, people living alone. And this trend is across all age groups. There's this phenomenon called godoksa, where people are dying by themselves. And it's, you can see it in some of the K-dramas, where people are living alone, and they die. And because there's not someone checking on them all the time, it can be days or weeks or even longer before someone's discovered. So that is increasing at a rate of 8.8%. The graph on the left shows the relative numbers between men and women, and men are dying at a much higher rate. more than half of those deaths are in the group 50s to 60s, but also 6.5% are young adults. And among these deaths, suicide is 18%. And but among those in their 20s and 30s, suicide is about half of the godoksa, the deaths alone. So, what can you do? Well, loneliness and social isolation in the United States costs the U.S. economy about $150 billion a year. Those are the estimates. In the UK and Japan, they've gone a step further. And in Japan, in 2021, appointed a minister of loneliness, an actual cabinet position. And just last year, in 2023, they enacted a law that created a task force led by the prime minister to tackle the issue of loneliness in Japan. The British have had a minister of loneliness since 2018, and they spent about $100 million to tackle loneliness. And it's just simple things. They have a loneliness awareness week. They have a chatty bench where people go and just talk to strangers about any kind of thing. They have a talking cafe where you go and you get coffee with other people. Nature walks, all kinds of things that they feel have actually improved the situation of loneliness in the UK. There's something also called social prescribing. A group of physicians in the National Health Service are actually prescribing things for patients like going to the chatty bench, like working with some of the NGOs that deal with loneliness, making sure that someone is calling them and talking to them. Now, in Korea, there are experiments. In Gyeongsangbuk-do, there's something called the Daewa Gibu Undong, the dialogue movement. And it's just a very straightforward program where they have volunteers who volunteer to have conversations with people who say they are lonely and would like to have conversations. And often it's just a phone call saying, "Are you okay? Have you eaten? What's going on?" And that in other countries with having done studies, it has shown to have very strong effects. The most famous example of this is actually in Malawi, where they had something called the Friendship Bench. They actually did a study where they had grannies, and grannies in Malawi are elderly women are very important members of the community, and so they trained these grannies in Malawi in cognitive behavioral therapy for depression. And so they just sit on the bench, and then people can come and sit and talk to them if they want. And they showed that of those who sat at the bench and spoke with the grannies, they had about a 40% better outcome with their depression than those who didn't sit at the bench. So these are all well-proven phenomena. And so I think it's great that Korea is trying to do this. Now, one of the things that's happening in mental health, I've been working a lot on mental health lately. One of the things that's happening in mental health is that people think that AI, that technology is going to solve everybody's problem, that AI can do therapy. I mean, there are AI programs that do cognitive behavioral therapy. But what we found is that the issue is not a particular technological innovation. The issue really is people need to be accompanied. People need to actually receive care. Now, at Yongin Silver, which is a very famous elder housing center, they have something called SUNY. And SUNY is the AI program that you talk to, but that monitors everything about you, that looks at how many times you open the refrigerator. And I think it could be helpful, but it doesn't get rid of the problem that people are, 41% of people are living alone, especially the elderly. And I'm just seeing that I'm depressing the hell out of everybody, and I hope nobody commits it. But again, I'm going to end with some ideas. But this is really important. I mean, I feel so embarrassed that I'm only learning about this now. The suicide issue, of course, is very serious. In Korea, 1 in 4 experience mental health problems. The official depression rate is only 5.4%. And that's because so little, such a small proportion of the people who are depressed in Korea ever go and get diagnosed. So 5.4% is how many are diagnosed with depression. The number has been going up since COVID, of course. In terms of surveys that measure stress, Korea has the highest amount of stress of all OECD countries. There's, of course, economic anxiety, societal competition, violence, so many different stressors that contribute to the suicide rate. And the estimation is that in 2015 anyway, almost $5 billion were lost because of suicides. This is a very complicated slide, but it's worth it. Stick with me on this one. It's worth going through. So if you look at, you can't hear me if I walk away. So if you look at that graph in the middle, right? So hold on, I can't. All right. So this graph in the middle is just suicides. Again, Korea is at the absolute highest end in OECD countries. The graph that's just below it with the orange, this is the percentage of people in Korea that are thought to have either depression or depressive symptoms, right? So they do a survey and ask mental health professionals and others, what do you think is the actual rate of suicide? So I showed you that number, 5.4%, but the actual expected rate of depression or depressive symptoms is 37% in Korea, the highest percentage, again, in OECD. This chart over here is the per capita dosing of antidepressant medications. So Korea has the highest rate of depression of all OECD countries, and it has the lowest rate. Well, only now next to Latvia. Latvia has a little bit lower rate, but Korea has a lowest rate of the use of antidepressants. And of course, you all know this is because of the stigma of going to a mental health practitioner. Young people's suicide rate is also increasing. And the little box, the blue box, I don't know if you can see it, but the title of it is South Korea's Shame. And this is from The Economist. Right? So The Economist specifically labeled the suicide rate as South Korea's shame. And of course, it's higher than anyone's. And in the Korean language box right there with a red circle, that is cause of death among young people in their 20s and 30s. And the leading cause of death among young people in their 20s and 30s is, again, suicide. Right? The suicide rate for Korean elderly people in their 70s and 80s is comparable to the suicide rate of Jewish elderly people living during the Nazi regime. That's how bad it is right now. There's only a little bit of good news. A little bit of good news is that the suicide rate for elderly people in their 70s and 80s seems to have dropped a little bit, but still the equivalent of what we saw during the Nazi regimes. Now, what are the causes? Again, these won't be a surprise to you. We started off, and this was Hwang's great insight. Emile Durkheim, the famous French sociologist, wrote a whole book on suicide. I studied him when I was doing my PhD in anthropology, and he talked about forms of solidarity in a society. He talked about mechanical solidarity in what they called primitive societies, and organic solidarity in the advanced economies at that time. But he saw suicide as a fundamental rupture in social solidarity. So, of course, the welfare system, but Korea has by far the highest poverty rate among OECD countries. And Professor Chong at Harvard said to me, this is the first generation that depleted all their assets taking care of their parents and then were abandoned by their own children. Now, he wasn't saying that, therefore the younger generation is morally corrupt. He was saying that the younger generation just can't support the older generation as they did before. So the first generation to deplete their resources, taking care of their parents, and then to be abandoned by their own children. This is why the poverty rate is so high and also the suicide rate so high. I had this, Christine Lagarde is now the governor of the central bank, the European Central Bank. But she was at the IMF when I was at the World Bank, and we were very good friends, and we talked about everything. And one day, they actually covered this in the Korean press. One day, I think we were talking on a panel, and I said, Christine, Korea is undergoing a lot of stress. Young people in Korea go to school from 7 to 11, right? And she looked at me and she said, well, that's amazing. How do they do so well on these standardized tests, only going to school 4 hours a day, right? and then I told her, it's 11 at night. And then a few years later, she went back to Korea. This was 2017. Went back to Korea as managing director of the IMF, and of course was completely briefed on all the social phenomena in Korea. And she said something very tough. She said, it looks to me that if Korea doesn't take action, you're going to be a collective suicide society, right? And she was talking about suicide. She was talking about the low birth rate. So lots of different issues to tackle. Of course, the stigma around mental health is still incredibly high. A good part of that is that on social media, it seems that young people are more open in talking about mental health and mental illness, but that hasn't spread to the whole of society. How am I doing with time? Okay. So there's been some progress. There's our stronger support systems. There's now a group of wonderful mental health practitioners. I was able to go to Korea this past fall and have these wonderful meetings with some of the leaders. And they have asked me to get involved and try to help them bring attention to this issue. So there has been some improvement. It went down a little bit in 2017, but it's now back up a little bit in 2022, but still the highest in the world. There's more awareness. There are more people who understand that suicide's an issue, but still stigma, still limited resources. And at the end of the day, it's not treatment programs that are going to bring the suicide rate down. You have to get at the fundamental social drivers of suicide, of depression, in order to really get a handle on this problem. So just as a comparison, only 1.9% of the total health spending in Korea is for mental health. And the OECD average is 5%. Now, it went up, and since 2017, it has gone up almost 83%, but it's still nowhere near the OECD average. And suicide prevention, so Korea as a whole spends $35 million on suicide prevention. And Japan, which has just, about maybe double the population, spent $640 million last year. And there are really good tales there, because Japan could very well be a model for Korea. When President Yoon has asked me to work with him on various issues, social issues, and so I showed him this graph, and he immediately responded. So the blue line is Japan, and the red line is Korea. In 1985, Japan had double the suicide rate of Korea, and now it's turned exactly the other way. So what has Japan done that's been so effective? It's been a whole of society movement. The prime ministers have been involved. Civil society has been involved, and there's been so much more effort to bring the suicide rate down over the last 15 years in Japan. And we feel that this is really a wonderful model that Korea could follow. And when President Yoon saw this, he immediately started saying, "Look, I think what was happening in Japan in 1985 is now happening in Korea in probably a much more severe way." And we're now trying to bring the expertise from the Japan experience to Korea. So again, one of the things you have to do is look around the world and say, has anybody been successful at taking on these kinds of suicide rates? And Finland is the best example. So light conditions, it's not light for very long in the day in the winter. Urbanization, feelings of isolation, stress. And so from 1965 to 1990, the suicide rate tripled. And Finland at that time in 1990 was their suicide rate was twice the OECD average. So they focused early detection, treatment, social support, active depression treatment. They did both medications and counseling. They increased social contact, restricted certain sales of alcohol, the reinforcement of suicide education programs in schools, regulation on media reporting on suicides. Very interesting. And so the program has reduced suicides from 30 per 100,000, which is a little higher than where Korea is now, to 12.9 per 1,000. Dramatic drop. And now Finland's suicide rate is about half of that of Korea. So it can be done. It's a different culture, different set of circumstances, but we know it can be done. So it's the time to act right now. Right now is the time to act. We cannot lose any more time. After many conversations with President Yoon, he established the Presidential Committee to Address Mental Health and Suicide. And I'm just showing you this because to show that I actually have been involved in this, I gave a presentation to this particular group. And his program is very interesting. Increased mental health services, suicide prevention, counseling, the workplace and emergency response, legal and policy initiatives, employment and insurance, sort of the standard things. You know, it's a great start. It's great that he started doing this. But as I said, it's not programs run by government or treatment. It has to be a whole of society effort. And one of the things I told him was that you could be the greatest advocate for suicide prevention by just talking about it. And he's promised to do that. He already has been a bit. And so, you know, leaders have to, you know, bring light to these kinds of issues. And I'm you know, very grateful for him continuing to ask for my support and then actually taking steps. So what can be done? You know, first and foremost, as I say at the top, tackle the social determinants. But these are all these things. I'm not going to go through them, but these are all things that were done in Japan. These are all things that were done in Finland. And if we follow the roadmap and get everyone involved, make this something that we really take on. I mean, just one issue, right? And when I was in Korea, I met with the leader of the NGO that takes care of remaining family members after someone commits suicide, right? And he told me stories about how incredibly stigmatized they become once one of their family members commits suicide. And there is no program yet that's specifically trying to address this. This is something that requires, I think, presidential intervention by you know, talking about this. That I guess it feels like almost you're a suicide family, and that could be contagious, and we want to have nothing to do with you. So those kinds of things are also needed in addition to just, you know, better treatment. To conclude, this is me. I think this is about 1962, right? So in doing this talk, I sort of, as I looked at all these numbers and how things have changed over time, I was born at a time when the birth rate was 6 children per woman. Half the population was living in households of 6 people or more. Korea was poorer than Somalia or Ghana, and their GDP per capita was less than Ghana or Somalia. There was no industry, and the World Bank thought that there was little hope for any internally driven growth. So that's the world I was born into. And then look what's happened now, right? And there's been such rapid growth. Now with this awareness, now that we know that we've gone full circle in terms of living in such extreme poverty with such a high birth rate to where we are now, what can be done? Is there anything in the recent history of Korea that suggests that great progress can be made? Well, when I went to the World Bank, right, I started learning more about the 1997-98 financial crisis. And there was a movement to collect gold in order to pay down the debt. And it turns out that wasn't the first one. In 1907, there was a national debt repayment movement. And the entire debt to Japan at the time, Japan had provided a bond to Korea that it couldn't pay back. And it was in the amount of 13 million won. So about I've tried to figure out how much that money was back in 1907, but it was 13 million won. And so they had this effort led by, I mean, one of the people who was leading it was a giseng, one of the hostesses, right? And it was across society. The idea was that if we're going to get our independence from Japan, we have to begin taking responsibility for things like the national debt. They raised, for a $13 million won debt, they raised about 190,000 won. But they tried. They gave it an effort. And then in 1997, of course, and Tom knows this very well, he was there. He was at Moody's watching this all unfold. the Asian financial crisis. Of course, Thailand changed its fixed exchange rate system. The Thai baht fell. The Korean won fell. Foreign borrowing by the financial institutions was blocked, and the IMF organized, it wasn't just the IMF, but the World Bank participated, other banks participated, a $55 billion bailout. This was talked about as the great shame. Talk about shame of Korea, the great shame of Korea. Foreign reserves dropped from 30 billion to 4 billion. External debt skyrocketed to over 150 billion. And in thinking about what they could do, on Christmas Day, 1997, December 25th, the KBS reported that there are people talking about a effort of all Koreans to bring their gold and donate it. I mean, I think there was some value that was given to it, but donate your gold to this effort to pay down the debt. So what happened? It was called the Gold Collection Movement, and from January 5th to April 30th, 3.5 million people participated. 227 tons of gold were collected at a value of about $2.13 billion. That was immediately given to the IMF, and they generated enough momentum where they were able to pay off the $55 billion entire IMF loan package in 3 years instead of the 6 years that they were allotted. So they did so well in tackling the financial crisis. But as you know, many people trace the current issues with mental health, suicide, loneliness, low birth rate back to the IMF period in Korean history. So the question is, Koreans dealt very quickly with the financial issues. Will they be able to step up and deal with this issue as well? I have to tell you, I'm very optimistic that something good can happen. This is what Koreans do, right? You know, what do they say? 하면 된다, right? I mean, we can do it, and I just think that we haven't brought enough attention to these three epidemics that are really coming together in a really noxious synergy in a way that we're not alive to yet. I'm going to leave you with just one story, right? This is from my time at the World Bank, and this is me in a classroom in Tanzania. And whenever I went on a country visit, I would always go to one classroom. And so when I went to this classroom, and this is a classroom of 10-year-olds, I always asked the question, so what do you guys want to be when you finish school and grow up? And so lots of people raised their hand. One boy raised his hand and was especially eager. And I said, so what do you want to be? He said, I want to be president of the World Bank. Right? So just like you, everybody laughed, right? But then it just struck me like a ton of bricks. I said, you know, in 1963, when I was 4 years old and living in Korea and going to preschool, the president of the World Bank group was George David Woods. And it's entirely conceivable that George David Woods would have visited Korea right at that time, because it was right at the time when Korea was trying to get a loan from the World Bank. And if he had come to my kindergarten and sat there in that room, I thought to myself, would he have thought that one of his successors was sitting in that room? So what I told them immediately was, hey, please don't tell these young people that they can't do something. Now, Tanzania has a lot of challenges. They've not yet been able to escape the kind of poverty that Korea escaped very quickly. This is a very different kind of problem. This is a very different kind of challenge. But at the end of the day, we have to talk about it. We have to find a way for civil society, the government, private sector, and experts to come together and really tackle this problem head on. Or we face a fundamental demographic crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before. I hope we can do it. I hope the Korea Society can lead us in having those conversations that we need to have to accomplish this. And I thank you very much for coming and for your attention.
We have just about 5 minutes. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and then we'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. I can personally empathize with many of the issues. My parents are over 80. They live in Korea. So fortunately, they're in good health, but I can see them if one of them gets sick, then the loneliness could be an issue. I've personally had a cousin who committed suicide at a fairly young age in Korea. And personally also, I did contribute to the National Pension Fund in Korea when I was there. So if it gets depleted by 2055, then it's also could be an issue for me to some extent.
Absolutely.
But question for you is, I mean, of the three issues, loneliness and suicide, from what I see or what you mentioned, these seem to be very addressable problems. The low birth rate sort of seems to be so daunting with the situation you mentioned, some of them education, everything, and with personally the context I have in Korea, just seems to be a very fundamental issue. And you mentioned in terms of looking at policies, looking at what has been working and not working, and you also mentioned suicide, why the president has been involved in it. What is your sense in terms of the efforts within Korea to really address it and the drive to get it done both politically as well as from a societal perspective?
Well, you're right, because the birth rate issue is going to require much more structural kinds of interventions than the other two. I mean, they all require structural interventions at some point. But again, I was very informed by Professor Chang, who said that the evaluation of the $200 billion spent so far has never been done. We actually don't know what is going to motivate people to have more children. We don't know what of the programs that have already been tried are working or not working. So that's just a fundamental thing that we've got to get going. And I hope President Yoon will do it. There's a way to, it would be the equivalent of what we in the United States would call a blue ribbon panel. A group of people that include government officials, but are bringing in people who are actual experts, people from civil society, to sit down and really go over the data, which of course the government would have to provide, to try to figure out what is going on. Why hasn't it worked? Why does it keep going down? Is there anything that's been useful? If not, stop spending money on these things that are not working. The people who've been promised that money for their children, they're going to have to be grandfathered in. They're going to have to continue to get that money. But is there another way to think about it? And again, Japan has had success. Italy has had success. France has had success. They've had very specific efforts to increase the birth rate, and in many places it has worked. So it can't be just government officials doing this and then doing that and then not sharing data. It has to be the best experts in the world who are looking at all the experiences everywhere and coming to the conclusion that here's what worked in all these places. This is not relevant for Korea. This is not relevant, but these things look very promising. I don't understand why we wouldn't do that, but we'll have to see.
Dr. Kim, thanks for your time. It was an honor to listen to you. And my name is John, and I currently work at the Federal Reserve Bank and work in financial policy. As you could probably tell, I'm Korean background myself. Immigrant, came here when I was 9. My question is, why has the Korean government, society been so slow in terms of interacting and dealing with the low birth rate? As you've shown in the graphs, it's been a problem for probably over a decade now, and a pretty dramatic and drastic problem. It seems every president that's been elected has made comments about the issue, but there hasn't been any progress in terms of policy. My second question is a bit more far-fetched, but in terms of this issue, has there been any discussion about looking at North Korea as well? Because ultimately, if we're talking about birth rate of Koreans, then North Korea is also Korea. So any sort of policy or study that's been done in terms of looking at North Korea as well?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I learned is that it's not that they've done nothing. $200 billion, since the mid 2000s. That's a significant investment, right? I think what they haven't done is get really granular about what's worked, what hasn't worked, what are the drivers, can we change the way that whatever money we have is allocated to encourage this. But I think the bigger issue is it's just so deeply structural. I mean, how do you provide housing security for all of these young people that don't have it now, right? That, the Jeonse system and all that, you need a big chunk of cash to be able to, get get stable housing, and even that, unless you own your home, you can get kicked out, at any time. So things like housing are so fundamental. In Singapore, they just basically made all the housing public housing, and they created an egalitarian system for young people to be able to find housing. I heard from a taxi driver in Hong Kong that he's trying to move to Singapore because he has no hope of getting married in Hong Kong. But in Singapore, he can get a home and then has a chance of getting married. So there are solutions out there, but it's going to take a lot of political will and courage to enact those. And at some point, I think the strains on the NPS, the national pension, the strain on society, the difficulty finding workers, at some point it's going to get so severe that they're going to have no choice but to take these more of these structural, make more of these structural interventions. But it's just, it's the hardest. You're right, absolutely.
We'll have one last question.
Really? Okay.
So, Dr. Kim, you started off the lecture by noting how far Korea has come, and how K-pop, K-drama. So in a way, so many Korean Americans and Koreans feel pride in being number one, if you will, going to the top. But we see that we're also number one in sort of the worst statistics. So is there in some ways, is there a correlation? As a society, we've decided that individual success was important. And we have grown by leaps and bounds, but as a consequence, or perhaps is there a relationship between that and what we're suffering now in terms of being the worst of the world? And if so, does it kind of require us as a society collectively say, we don't have to be number one. Yeah. We don't have to be the best. But as a society, we're going to be satisfied by being up there in the 2/3, but we're also going to ameliorate a situation that's going to ultimately mean the demise of our community. Thank you.
So a good friend of mine who's now a very famous writer, and I don't have permission to say this, so I'm not going to give you her name, but she said to me, the problem with Korea all goes back to Hongiltong. Right? And I said, what are you talking about? And so for those of you who don't know, Hongiltong is this heroic figure who is the best at everything. And she says that that kind of story in Korean culture, making everyone want to be the best, has really driven us down this path. Right? And so a group of economists actually did a study. So what if we did back off? What if we completely outlawed hagwons, the cram centers? What if we completely outlawed this kind of incredibly vicious competition? What if we did that? And they said, well, there would probably be happier people, there would probably be more children, but everyone would be poorer, right? Because you wouldn't have the kind of incredible achievement that you have right now, right? So, I mean no offense to anyone, right? But everyone I talk to in Korea has what, just for lack of a better word, their own ketong charak on why this is. Everyone has their own big ideas about this is what it is. And I think what I've learned in preparing for this, and Mr. Hwang, I want you to know, you really, I spent many, many hours trying to understand this issue because I took seriously what you wanted to do with this lecture series. And I think what I've learned is that there's no one answer to any of this. And the hard part is going to be to have the humility to make the kind of structural changes for the good of society. Right? Now, I didn't answer the question on North Korea, but let me go back to that. Right? So anyone who thinks that, well, if you just reunited the country, you'd have cheap labor, all these things would work out. Well, at the World Bank, we were in the middle of discussions about what would happen if North Korea opened up. Right? And what we learned was that in Germany, the cost to West Germany to integrate East Germany was $100 billion a year for 20 years. Right? And so, the Koreas are smaller, but you cannot underestimate the expense of integrating North Korea into South Korea. And in Germany, they were relatively more equal than the poorest country in the world and one of the richest countries in the world. That's what we're looking at. So There may be, there may be discussions about this, but I don't think it's an easy solution. I think the complexities of reunification are going to be very difficult. At the World Bank, we had this wonderful experience of bringing Myanmar out of total isolation and bringing them into the global system. We were right there in the middle of doing that, and I'm sure the North Koreans were watching. It was a complicated but ultimately successful process. Now, there are problems in Myanmar still, but they now have cellular service. They have a relatively open economy from before. It's growing. There are a lot of great things that happened in Myanmar, and I even talked to the leaders in Myanmar and asked them if they ever talked to their friends in North Korea, and they said they do, right? But the first thing you have to do if you want the kind of massive assistance that Myanmar got was that you have to share your economic data with everybody. Right? And, first with the IMF, but then everybody else. That's going to be the hardest part.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim, and thank you, Mr. Hwang, for sponsoring this amazing and great kickoff for this new series. I knew a little about this, but I've learned so much today from your presentation. So I would have to say it definitely is eye-opening, and this really is an existential threat. We talk about other existential threats that may or may not be, but this really is. So I could see, we could develop this further with your program, or else we can start a new program series at the Korea Society on the triple demic that Korea is facing. So thanks again for your time and for your presentation.
Thank you.